Everyone mocked her. They called her naive, selfish, and out of touch. They couldn't understand why she would adopt a black child, and in their eyes it seemed like a decision made without thinking about the consequences. She had been warned time and time again, by strangers, by family, even by people who claimed to care about her. "You're setting yourself up for a lifetime of trouble," they said. "You'll never know how to deal with him. He won't fit in." These were the voices that surrounded her as she made what would be the most important decision of her life: adopting a child, a beautiful, bright-eyed boy from a different race, a different world. And yet, despite the doubt, despite the constant whispers, she believed in him. She believed in love. She believed in family. But even as she sat there with him, holding his tiny hand in hers, she couldn't ignore the sense of doubt creeping into her own heart. The road ahead would be hard. There would be challenges, so many challenges. People would look at her differently, and the world would judge them both. It wasn't going to be easy, and deep down she knew it. But there was something about the way he looked up at her with those trusting eyes that made her push all the doubts aside. She loved him, and that's what mattered. Fast forward to the next 25 years, and things have drastically changed. The boy, once the subject of harsh whispers, is now a man. But not just any man. A man whose name rings out in circles no one could have predicted. He has become a figure that some people can't even fathom, a success story beyond the wildest imaginations of those who mocked him and his mother all those years ago. Those same people who once doubted him now find themselves struggling to wrap their heads around who he has become. It's a transformation so remarkable that it feels almost impossible, like a fairy tale, but real. The kind of success and impact that leaves people speechless. But how did this happen? How did a boy, once considered to be a lost cause, rise to become someone who would change everything for those who once doubted him? The road wasn't smooth. In fact, the hardships were brutal. There were days when he thought of giving up, when the weight of the world was too much. And yet, through it all, something kept him going. What was it? What was the spark that turned him into someone who would defy the odds and silence every critic? This story isn't just about a mother and son. It's about resilience. It's about breaking barriers and pushing past expectations. It's about proving that love, family, and belief in each other can truly overcome the darkest of doubts. The question isn't just what this boy became, but how he did it, and who helped him along the way. But the real question remains: what exactly was it that led him to become who he is today? Was it the unconditional love of a mother who refused to back down in the face of adversity, or was it something deeper? And most importantly, will the people who once mocked him ever truly understand the magnitude of what he has become? Stay with me as we dive into this story of transformation, of trials and triumphs, and the untold journey that led him to a place no one ever thought he could reach. And as we take this journey together, we'll uncover just how extraordinary a story of love and perseverance can truly be. The boy's name was Jamal. He was only 4 years old when he came into her life, his small frame trembling in her arms as they walked out of the adoption agency. The woman who took him home was Sarah, a single mother in her early 30s, with dreams bigger than the quiet town she lived in. People had warned her that adopting a black child was going to be hard, especially in a place where racial diversity was still a foreign concept to most. But Sarah didn't care about the noise. She didn't care about the judgment. She had known from the moment she met Jamal that he was her son, but this was a love story she couldn't walk away from. Still, the early days weren't easy. They lived in a neighborhood where most of the families were white, and it didn't take long for the gossip to start. People eyed them with suspicion when they went to the grocery store or walked to the park. They whispered behind their hands when they passed by. Sarah didn't know exactly what they said, but she could feel the weight of their stares. What was she thinking? Doesn't she know it's going to be hard for him? Even her own family didn't understand. Her parents were supportive at first, but as time passed, cracks began to form in their support. They wondered aloud if Sarah had made a mistake. Maybe she had gotten too carried away with her own ideals, too caught up in trying to do good for the world. They questioned if she was truly ready for what was coming, for the burden of raising a black son in a society that still had deep-rooted prejudices. "It's not just about giving him love," her father had said one day, his voice laced with concern. "The world won't treat him the same way they'll treat your other children, Sarah. You can't protect him from that." But Sarah wasn't backing down, not for a second. She had promised herself that she would give Jamal the life he deserved, no matter what anyone thought. Even when he had his first run-ins with kids at school who made fun of his hair or his skin, even when teachers underestimated his potential, Sarah stayed by his side. Every single day, she reminded him how special he was, how the color of his skin didn't define who he could be. By the time Jamal was in high school, Sarah had learned to block out the whispers and the stares. She had her son's back, and that was all that mattered. But the pressure didn't let up. People still doubted his future, still looked at him with a sense of pity or skepticism. "He'll probably be just another statistic," one of Sarah's old friends had said when Jamal was 16. "You've given him all this love, but what's that really going to do when the world doesn't see him for who he is?" Despite the doubt that loomed over him, Jamal had a fire inside. It wasn't always easy to see, and it certainly wasn't obvious to everyone who met him. On the surface, he seemed like any other teenager, quiet, unsure of himself at times, and just trying to fit in. But there was something more beneath the surface. A resilience that couldn't be broken. A hunger to prove to the world that he was more than just the labels people put on him. But that hunger didn't always manifest in ways Sarah could understand. Sometimes it led him down dark paths, gravitating toward the wrong crowd, skipping classes, and getting into trouble. There were moments when Sarah was terrified that the boy she had loved with all her heart was slipping away, consumed by the pressures of a world that didn't seem to care about his potential. It wasn't until the summer before his senior year that something inside of Jamal shifted. Sarah had just returned home from work one evening when she found him sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a stack of papers in front of him. He didn't look up when she entered, but there was something different about him that night. He had always been quiet, but tonight there was a certain weight to the silence, a tension in the air that Sarah couldn't ignore. "Jamal?" she asked softly, sitting across from him. He didn't respond right away, his eyes scanning the papers. Finally, he looked up, and for the first time in a long while, Sarah saw something she hadn't seen in him for years: determination. "I've decided what I want to do with my life," he said, his voice low but firm. "I'm going to college. I don't know how, but I'm going to make it happen." It was a moment that left Sarah speechless. She had heard him talk about college before, but this time it was different. This wasn't just a dream, it was a decision. He was committed, and there was a fire in his eyes that she hadn't seen before. She had spent years telling him he could be anything he wanted, but it had never truly clicked for him until now. The next few months were a blur of applications, scholarships, and late-night study sessions. Sarah watched as Jamal threw himself into his schoolwork, determined to change the narrative that had been written for him since he was a child. But it wasn't just the grades. It was the change in his demeanor, the way he carried himself with a sense of purpose. He was no longer the boy who tried to fit in or shrink into the background. He was someone ready to step up and claim his future. The day he got his acceptance letter was one of the happiest moments of Sarah's life. She had always known Jamal was capable of greatness, but seeing it come to fruition before her eyes was something else entirely. But even as the world celebrated Jamal's accomplishments, there were whispers that didn't go away. They still looked at him differently. They still judged him based on his past, based on the assumptions they had made all those years ago. By the time he left for college, Jamal had already faced more obstacles than most people would ever dream of. But it was there, at university, that everything began to change in ways no one could have predicted. The lessons, the struggles, the growth, it all started to build towards something bigger. But what that something was, even Sarah couldn't guess. The truth was, no one really knew what was to come. Jamal was about to step into a world far beyond what anyone had envisioned for him. And those who doubted him, they were about to witness something so extraordinary, so unexpected, that it would leave them speechless. What was it that would take this boy, once written off by so many, and turn him into someone who would defy all the odds? How would the world respond to the man he was becoming? And more importantly, would anyone ever truly understand the power of love, persistence, and belief in the face of overwhelming doubt? The answers were coming, but not yet. Jamal's first year at college was a whirlwind. The campus, with its diverse student body and bustling social scene, was both a breath of fresh air and an overwhelming challenge. For the first time in his life, he wasn't the only one of his race in the room, and yet, there were moments when he felt more isolated than ever. No one told him how difficult it would be to navigate the world of higher education as a black student, especially coming from a background where the odds were always stacked against him. In class, Jamal excelled. His professors were impressed with his critical thinking, his ability to engage with complex ideas, and his unwavering commitment to his studies. But outside the classroom, it was a different story. Despite the multicultural environment, Jamal still found himself caught between worlds. Some students treated him like a curiosity, others simply ignored him. It was subtle, but the microaggressions were there. The offhand comments about black culture that didn't quite sit right. The way some of his classmates would speak to him as though his accomplishments were a result of some sort of affirmative action rather than his hard work and intellect. He had grown used to the stares, the whispers, the judgment, but here it felt different. The more he tried to fit in, the more he realized that even among peers, his race would always set him apart. But what really started to eat at him was the pressure. The pressure to prove everyone wrong, to not just succeed, but to outperform everyone else, to silence the voices in his head that had been planted there over the years. You're not good enough. They'll always see you as different. These were the doubts that tried to creep in when he was alone, when he was struggling. Jamal couldn't escape the sense that every move he made was being watched, and every failure, no matter how small, would be proof of the things others had said about him. He was determined to prove them wrong, but at what cost? Sarah saw the change in him too. Over the phone, when they talked, Jamal seemed different, more distant, more guarded. He spoke less about his classes and more about the stress he was feeling. She could hear it in his voice, the weight of expectations pressing down on him. She'd always known how hard it would be for him to navigate life in a world that hadn't quite figured out how to accept him fully, but this was something new. This wasn't the hopeful, determined boy who had set out to prove the world wrong. This was someone fighting a battle he didn't know how to win. There was one moment, in particular, that stuck with Sarah. One evening, a few months into the semester, Jamal called her crying. It was late, and the sound of his voice, broken and vulnerable, shattered her heart. "I don't know if I can do this, Mom," he had said, his voice trembling. "I feel like I'm just here to prove a point. I don't feel like I belong here. No matter what I do, it feels like I'm just different." Sarah didn't know what to say. She had always believed in Jamal's strength, in his ability to overcome anything. But hearing him like this, so unsure of himself, rattled her. She wanted to reassure him, to tell him that everything would be okay, but she knew deep down that the struggle he was facing wasn't something she could fix with a few comforting words. This was his fight, and it wasn't just about school. It was about the expectations that came with being a black man in a world that often didn't see him as an individual. "Jamal," she said softly, "you've always belonged, baby. You're not just here to prove something to them. You're here because you deserve to be. Don't let anyone take that away from you." But even as Sarah spoke those words, she wondered if Jamal believed them. If he truly saw himself the way she did. And if he didn't, what could she do to help him see it? Meanwhile, on campus, things were taking a different turn. Jamal's roommate, Luke, had become someone he could confide in, someone who genuinely seemed to care about his well-being. Luke was from a wealthy family, and though he wasn't part of the elite crowd, he had the privilege of not worrying about things like race and identity. To him, Jamal's struggles seemed abstract, but his friendship was genuine. They spent late nights talking about life, the challenges of growing up, and how hard it was to carve a place for yourself in a world that didn't always make space for you. Yet, even Luke, who had become a close friend, didn't fully understand the weight Jamal carried. One night, after a particularly stressful exam, the two of them were hanging out in their dorm room when Luke made a comment that cut deeper than he realized. "You know, man, you're doing great. You're one of the most driven people I know. Honestly, I think you're gonna be one of those success stories. You know, like people who come from rough backgrounds and then make it big. Like a movie or something." At first, Jamal just laughed it off, but something about Luke's words stung. "A success story," he repeated, his voice quiet. "Is that how you see me?" Luke, oblivious to the weight of his words, shrugged. "I mean, yeah, you've got all the right things going for you. Just keep doing what you're doing, and you'll be fine." But to Jamal, it wasn't that simple. The idea of being a success story was an expectation he didn't know how to carry. It felt like another weight on his shoulders. As much as he wanted to be successful, he didn't want to be reduced to a narrative that simplified everything about him to a single, neatly packaged story. He didn't want to be the black kid who made it out just to satisfy people's desire for an uplifting tale. He wanted to be seen as more than that. The tension between the expectations placed on him and his own desires to carve out his own path was building up inside him. He wanted to make his mother proud, but he also wanted to break free from the idea that his life was something to be used as an example for others to point at. He wasn't a lesson. He wasn't a statistic. He was Jamal. And yet, every time he took a step forward, it felt like the world was waiting for him to fall back into the role they had assigned him. As the weeks went on, Jamal found himself increasingly isolated. He wasn't sure who he was anymore, or if the version of him he presented to the world was the real one. He began to question whether the people around him, his friends, his professors, even his family, could truly see him, or if they were all just projecting their own assumptions onto him. The harder he tried to find his place, the more elusive it seemed. And in the depths of his confusion, one thing remained certain: the world was still watching. As the months wore on, the pressure on Jamal only intensified. His professors were pushing him harder, expecting more from him now that his potential had become undeniable. But what no one could see was how close he was to breaking. Every assignment felt like a mountain to climb, every test a reminder of how much he had to prove, not just to them but to himself. The doubts were louder now, louder than the voice of the boy who had once been full of dreams. Those doubts weren't just whispers anymore. They were roars, constantly gnawing at him, telling him that he wasn't enough, that he wasn't as capable as everyone thought. Luke noticed the change in him before anyone else did. Late one evening, as they sat together in their dorm room, the weight of the silence between them became unbearable. Jamal had been distant for weeks, shutting himself off from everyone around him. He spent his nights in the library, studying until the early hours of the morning, and his days in class, too exhausted to even think straight. "Hey man," Luke said cautiously, breaking the silence. "What's going on with you? You've been different lately." Jamal didn't look up from his textbook. His fingers were stiff as he tapped the pen on the pages, trying to focus on the words that seemed to blur in front of his eyes. He wanted to tell Luke everything: the crushing pressure, the loneliness, the fear that no matter how hard he tried, it would never be enough. But instead, he just shrugged, not trusting his voice to say what he needed to. "I'm fine," Jamal muttered, though they both knew it wasn't true. Luke didn't press in further, but Jamal could feel the worry in his eyes. He had been so focused on getting through the next task, the next paper, the next exam, that he had stopped thinking about what any of it actually meant. His days were a blur of deadlines and exhaustion, and it seemed like everyone around him had forgotten that he was just a person, a human being with limits. No one ever asked him how he was holding up. They just assumed he could keep going, that he could keep achieving, because that's what he had always done. But the truth was, he was starting to lose himself in the process. One afternoon, as the campus buzzed with excitement over the upcoming spring break, Jamal found himself alone in the library, staring at a blank page on his laptop. The deadline for his final project was looming, but no words came to him. His mind was a fog of confusion, each idea slipping through his fingers before he could grasp it. He thought back to everything he had worked for, the late nights, the sacrifices, the dreams of proving himself to the world, and suddenly, none of it seemed worth it. What was the point of all this if it didn't even make him happy? What was the point if no one really saw him? That was when the email notification popped up on his screen. It was from the university's prestigious Student Award Committee, congratulating him on being nominated for a scholarship for exceptional students. It was an honor, something that could help him push further into his academic career. But as Jamal stared at the email, a cold sense of dread washed over him. He should have been thrilled. He should have felt proud. But instead, he felt nothing. It wasn't the achievement that bothered him. It was the weight of the expectation that came with it. If he accepted this award, if he embraced the praise, he would be stuck in the same cycle of validation seeking that had consumed him for so long. It wasn't his success people cared about. It was the story they had built around him. They saw him as a symbol, a narrative to be celebrated, not as a person, and that thought made his stomach twist with unease. That night, Jamal made a decision. He couldn't keep living in this way. He couldn't keep pushing himself to be something everyone else wanted him to be. He needed to escape it all, even if just for a little while. So he packed a bag, sent a quick message to Luke, and left without a word to anyone else. Sarah didn't hear from him for days. The silence between them was deafening. She tried calling, texting, even reaching out to his friends, but there was no answer. Panic started to settle in. She knew something was wrong. She could feel it in her bones. She had always believed in Jamal's strength, but this time, she wasn't sure if it was enough to carry him through. The days dragged on, and Sarah couldn't help but think back to all those years when she had promised herself that she would be there for him, no matter what. She had always been his rock, the one person who never doubted him, no matter how many people around them did. But now she felt powerless. She couldn't fix this. She couldn't give him the answers he was looking for. All she could do was wait, hoping that her son would come back to her when he was ready. The harder he tried to find his place, the more elusive it seemed. And in the depths of his confusion, one thing remained certain: the world was still watching. As the months wore on, the pressure on Jamal only intensified. His professors were pushing him harder, expecting more from him now that his potential had become undeniable. But what no one could see was how close he was to breaking. Every assignment felt like a mountain to climb, every test a reminder of how much he had to prove, not just to them but to himself. The doubts were louder now, louder than the voice of the boy who had once been full of dreams. Those doubts weren't just whispers anymore. They were roars, constantly gnawing at him, telling him that he wasn't enough, that he wasn't as capable as everyone thought. Luke noticed the change in him before anyone else did. Late one evening, as they sat together in their dorm room, the weight of the silence between them became unbearable. Jamal had been distant for weeks, shutting himself off from everyone around him. He spent his nights in the library, studying until the early hours of the morning, and his days in class, too exhausted to even think straight. "Hey man," Luke said cautiously, breaking the silence. "What's going on with you? You've been different lately." Jamal didn't look up from his textbook. His fingers were stiff as he tapped the pen on the pages, trying to focus on the words that seemed to blur in front of his eyes. He wanted to tell Luke everything: the crushing pressure, the loneliness, the fear that no matter how hard he tried, it would never be enough. But instead, he just shrugged, not trusting his voice to say what he needed to. "I'm fine," Jamal muttered, though they both knew it wasn't true. Luke didn't press in further, but Jamal could feel the worry in his eyes. He had been so focused on getting through the next task, the next paper, the next exam, that he had stopped thinking about what any of it actually meant. His days were a blur of deadlines and exhaustion, and it seemed like everyone around him had forgotten that he was just a person, a human being with limits. No one ever asked him how he was holding up. They just assumed he could keep going, that he could keep achieving, because that's what he had always done. But the truth was, he was starting to lose himself in the process. One afternoon, as the campus buzzed with excitement over the upcoming spring break, Jamal found himself alone in the library, staring at a blank page on his laptop. The deadline for his final project was looming, but no words came to him. His mind was a fog of confusion, each idea slipping through his fingers before he could grasp it. He thought back to everything he had worked for, the late nights, the sacrifices, the dreams of proving himself to the world, and suddenly, none of it seemed worth it. What was the point of all this if it didn't even make him happy? What was the point if no one really saw him? That was when the email notification popped up on his screen. It was from the university's prestigious Student Award Committee, congratulating him on being nominated for a scholarship for exceptional students. It was an honor, something that could help him push further into his academic career. But as Jamal stared at the email, a cold sense of dread washed over him. He should have been thrilled. He should have felt proud. But instead, he felt nothing. It wasn't the achievement that bothered him. It was the weight of the expectation that came with it. If he accepted this award, if he embraced the praise, he would be stuck in the same cycle of validation seeking that had consumed him for so long. It wasn't his success people cared about. It was the story they had built around him. They saw him as a symbol, a narrative to be celebrated, not as a person. And that thought made his stomach twist with unease. That night, Jamal made a decision. He couldn't keep living in this way. He couldn't keep pushing himself to be something everyone else wanted him to be. He needed to escape it all, even if just for a little while. So he packed a bag, sent a quick message to Luke, and left without a word to anyone else. Sarah didn't hear from him for days. The silence between them was deafening. She tried calling, texting, even reaching out to his friends, but there was no answer. Panic started to settle in. She knew something was wrong. She could feel it in her bones. She had always believed in Jamal's strength, but this time she wasn't sure if it was enough to carry him through. The days dragged on, and Sarah couldn't help but think back to all those years when she had promised herself that she would be there for him, no matter what. She had always been his rock, the one person who never doubted him, no matter how many people around them did. But now she felt powerless. She couldn't fix this. She couldn't give him the answers he was looking for. All she could do was wait, hoping that her son would come back to her when he was ready. Meanwhile, Jamal was miles away from everything he knew. He had checked into a small, quiet motel on the outskirts of town, far from the campus, far from the life he had built. The isolation was exactly what he needed. For the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to just breathe. No expectations, no judgments, no deadlines. But even in his solitude, Jamal couldn't escape the thoughts that had been eating at him. The longer he stayed in this limbo, the more he realized he couldn't run away forever. His life, his future, it all depended on the choices he made in the next few days. He knew that the longer he stayed in this place of uncertainty, the more he risked losing everything he had worked for. But part of him wasn't sure he even wanted it anymore. Back at the university, word of Jamal's disappearance began to spread. The professors who had once admired his ambition were now concerned. His friends were worried. Luke, who had no idea where Jamal had gone, started calling around, asking anyone if they had heard from him. The tension on campus grew as everyone waited for Jamal to return, but nobody knew if or when he would. The countdown to his final decision was ticking, but Jamal couldn't hear it over the pounding in his chest. Everything he had worked for, everything he had dreamed of, was on the line. But would it be enough to save him from the overwhelming weight of it all? Would he return to the world he had built for himself, or would he walk away, leaving everything behind to find his own way? The answers were coming, but the closer they got, the more uncertain everything seemed. As Jamal sat alone in that quiet motel room, the silence felt both soothing and suffocating. He had never been someone to run away from his problems. He had always faced them head-on, finding solutions where others saw only obstacles. But this time, things felt different. This time, he wasn't sure what the solution was, or if there even was one. The life he had worked so hard to build, the future he had been chasing, now felt like a distant dream, something out of reach, something he wasn't even sure he wanted anymore. The phone in his hand buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was a message from Luke. Asterisk, where are you? I'm really worried, man. People are talking about you. You can't just disappear like this. Call me. Asterisk. Jamal stared at the message for a long moment. The familiar anxiety began to creep back in, the nagging feeling that no matter where he went, no matter how far he ran, the pressure would follow him. It would always follow him. He wasn't sure if he was ready to face that yet, but he also couldn't stay hidden forever. With a deep breath, he tapped out a quick response, trying to sound more composed than he felt. Asterisk, I just need some space, Luke. I'll be fine. Don't worry. Asterisk. But even as he sent the message, Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that he was lying. He wasn't fine. He hadn't been fine for a long time. A few hours later, there was another knock on the door of his motel room. Jamal froze. He wasn't expecting anyone, and his first instinct was to ignore it. But the knock came again, more urgent this time, followed by a voice that made his blood run cold. Jamal, it's me, Sarah. His heart sank. How did she find him? How did she know where he was? He hadn't told anyone where he'd gone, not even Luke. The realization hit him like a wave. He hadn't planned on anyone finding him, least of all his mom. She wasn't supposed to be here, not in the place where he had come to confront the very things that had been haunting him. Taking a deep breath, Jamal stood up and opened the door. There, standing in front of him, was Sarah, her face etched with worry, her eyes searching him for any sign of the son she had raised. She wasn't angry, she was scared, and that fear made Jamal's heart ache. "Why didn't you call?" Sarah asked softly, her voice shaking. "I've been trying to reach you for days. You can't just disappear like that, Jamal. I don't know what's going on, but I need you to come back with me." Jamal opened his mouth to respond, but the words didn't come. He had no explanation, no way to tell her how trapped he felt, how exhausted he was by trying to live up to everyone's expectations. He wanted to say that he was sorry, that he would go back, but he couldn't. Not yet. "Mom, Jamal started, but his voice faltered. "I can't go back right now. I don't know what I'm supposed to do anymore. It's too much. All of it." Sarah's expression softened, and she stepped into the room, her arms wrapping around him in a tight embrace. Jamal didn't know how to react. Part of him wanted to pull away, to remain in his isolation, but part of him, deep down, was grateful for her presence, even if it was the last thing he thought he needed. "I don't know what's going on inside your head right now, but I do know that you don't have to do this alone," Sarah said, her voice a mixture of tenderness and pain. "You've always been strong, Jamal, but you don't have to carry everything by yourself. Let me help." For the first time in weeks, Jamal felt a crack in the armor he had built around himself. But before he could say anything, the door to the motel room swung open behind them, and Jamal turned to see a familiar figure standing in the doorway. "Luke." "Jamal," Luke said, his voice laced with concern, "I've been looking everywhere for you." Jamal's heart pounded in his chest. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected to face Luke in this moment, especially not with his mother standing there. He wasn't ready for any of it. But the reality of his situation hit him like a cold wave. He couldn't hide from his problems any longer. They had all found him, and now the weight of his decisions was crushing down on him. I didn't know where else to go," Jamal muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I just needed to figure things out." Sarah and Luke exchanged glances, their worry evident. But instead of pushing him further, Luke stepped forward and placed a hand on Jamal's shoulder. "We're all here, man," Luke said quietly. "You don't have to figure it out alone. Whatever you're going through, we're with you." For a moment, the room was silent. Jamal felt the overwhelming emotions of the past few months flood through him: fear, uncertainty, anger, and sadness. It had all been building inside him, and now, with Sarah and Luke standing by his side, it was impossible to hold it in any longer. "I just wanted to be enough," Jamal whispered, his voice cracking. "I wanted to prove to everyone that I could do it, that I could make it. But I don't know if I'm strong enough to carry this anymore. I don't know if I can keep pretending that everything is okay. The words hung in the air like a heavy weight. It was the confession Jamal had been too afraid to make, the admission that he wasn't invincible, that he wasn't perfect, that he too had limits. And just when he thought he might be able to breathe a little easier, the phone in his pocket buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a message from Luke or Sarah. It was an email. Jamal glanced down, his heart skipping a beat as he read the subject line, *URGNT. Scholarship acceptance deadline approaching *. The email was a stark reminder that even though Jamal had tried to escape the world he had built for himself, it wasn't going to let him go that easily. The pressure was still there, looming over him, demanding a decision that he wasn't ready to make. But as Jamal stared at the glowing screen, something inside him shifted. It wasn't the scholarship or the praise or the validation he needed. It was the realization that his story wasn't over. And maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to follow the script everyone else had written for him. Maybe it was time to write his own ending. But what would that ending be? Would he return to school, pick up the pieces of his life, and continue down the path he had started? Or would he finally step off the track, choosing a completely different future for himself? The answer, Jamal knew, would change everything. Jamal stood there, the glowing screen of the phone casting an eerie light on his face, his eyes locked on the email. The deadline, the scholarship, the validation. Everything he had worked for, everything that had made him feel seen in a world that had once seemed so determined to overlook him, was waiting for him to make a choice. But as the words on the screen blurred, Jamal felt the weight of his decision settle around him. The pressure, the suffocating pressure, had followed him even here, even in this motel room, even with Sarah and Luke standing beside him. It wasn't just the scholarship he had to choose anymore, it was his entire future. It was who he wanted to be, what kind of life he wanted to live. For so long, Jamal had lived with the idea that he had to be perfect, that he had to be something bigger than himself in order to prove his worth. But now, as the silence stretched between him, Sarah, and Luke, he realized that maybe the most important thing wasn't what others expected of him, it was what he expected of himself. He didn't need to live for the accolades, the recognition, or the story others had written for him. He needed to find his own voice, his own path. "I don't want it," Jamal said, his voice steady for the first time in weeks. "I don't want the scholarship. I don't want to keep living up to this idea of what I'm supposed to be." Sarah's eyes widened with surprise. Luke shifted uncomfortably, unsure of how to react, but Jamal could see the relief in their eyes. He was finally speaking the truth. The weight that had been crushing him for so long seemed to lift, if only slightly, as he took that first step toward freedom. "I want to find something that matters to me," Jamal continued, his voice growing stronger. "I don't know what that is yet, but I need to figure it out. I can't keep pretending I know who I'm supposed to be. I'm not sure of anything right now, but I know I need to stop trying to be what everyone else wants me to be." For a long moment, the room was silent. Sarah stepped forward, her hand gently resting on his arm, her eyes filled with both understanding and pride. "I'm so proud of you, Jamal," she said quietly. "I'm proud of you for being honest with yourself." But just as Jamal began to feel a sense of clarity, a sense of peace that had eluded him for so long, the door to the room suddenly burst open. Standing there, panting as if she had been running, was the last person Jamal expected to see, Carly, the woman who had been the driving force behind the constant pressure to succeed. She was the one who had always told him that he was destined for greatness, that he was meant to be more than just a success story. "Jamal, wait." Carly's voice was frantic, her eyes wild. "You can't just throw this away. You don't understand what you're walking away from. This scholarship, it's everything." Jamal's stomach twisted as he faced her. For a moment, he was struck speechless by her urgency, by the way she had barged into his life, just as she always had. She wasn't just his mentor, she was the embodiment of the pressure that had been choking him for years. The very person who had taught him that success was the only thing that mattered, that anything less than perfection was failure. "You don't get it, do you?" Jamal finally said, his voice firm. "You've been pushing me to be this person I'm not, and I'm tired of it. I don't want to be the story you've written for me anymore. I'm done." Carly recoiled, her face falling. "You're making a huge mistake," she whispered. "You'll regret this. You don't know what you're throwing away." But Jamal's resolve didn't waver. He had already made his decision. The words had been building inside him for so long, and now that he had spoken them, he felt an overwhelming sense of relief. He didn't know what his future would look like, but he finally felt like he was in control of his own life, not just following the path that others had laid out for him. Just as Carly turned to leave, her face filled with frustration, a soft ding echoed through the room, the sound of another email arriving on Jamal's phone. Everyone fell silent as he unlocked it, his hands trembling just slightly. The subject line made his heart stop. *URGENT, Scholarship Decision Update. You have been selected as the recipient *. Jamal's breath caught in his throat. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. After everything, after all the turmoil, after finally walking away from the very thing he had worked so hard to achieve, it was happening. He had been chosen. The very thing he had feared most was now in his hands. But there was something different about this moment, something unexpected. He stared at the email, at the words in front of him, and as the shock settled in, he realized something profound. The scholarship wasn't the thing that mattered. It had never been about the scholarship, or the prize, or the recognition. It had always been about the decision he was now facing, the decision to step into his own truth, to walk away from the pressure, from the expectations. And the fact that he had been chosen, despite his doubts and fears, was nothing more than a reminder that he had always had the power to decide his own path. Carly's frantic voice echoed in the background, but Jamal didn't hear her anymore. He didn't need to. The email could have been $1 million, and it wouldn't have changed the clarity he had found in that moment. He had spent his life trying to make others proud, trying to follow their script, and now, for the first time in his life, he was writing his own. "I don't need this," Jamal said, his voice clear and unwavering. He turned off the phone, putting it aside, leaving the world of expectations and pressures behind. "I don't need to prove anything to anyone anymore." Luke and Sarah stood quietly behind him, their faces full of understanding. Carly, meanwhile, stood in the doorway, her expression one of disbelief, as if she couldn't quite grasp what had just happened. But Jamal wasn't worried about her anymore. He wasn't worried about anyone except for himself. As the door slowly closed, Jamal finally felt free. The weight that had been crushing him for so long was gone, replaced by a sense of peace he hadn't known he was capable of. And just as he stepped into the next chapter of his life, the final twist hit him. There was something in the email that he hadn't noticed before, something buried at the bottom in fine print. A new opportunity, one that had always been waiting for him. It was an invitation to a program designed for those who wanted to build a life on their own terms, to break free from the traditional path and create something entirely unique. It wasn't the scholarship, it wasn't the prize, but it was exactly what he needed. Jamal's journey wasn't over, it was just beginning. Jamal sat back on the bed, staring at the email in his hands. He had turned off the phone's screen and placed it aside, but now it felt as if the world had opened up to him in ways he had never anticipated. The weight of the decision to walk away from the scholarship, from everything that had been expected of him, still lingered, but it was no longer suffocating. Instead, he felt light, almost like he had just shed a skin that had been suffocating him for years. The fine print at the bottom of the email, the invitation to a program designed to help people like him, those who wanted to build their own path, free from the pressures of traditional success, was the final piece of the puzzle. He had never heard of it before, but now that it was in front of him, it seemed like the universe had been waiting for him to make this decision. He didn't need the scholarship. What he needed was the opportunity to finally be himself, to chart his own course, to break free from the mold he had been trying to fit into for so long. "Mom, Luke," Jamal said, his voice steady, though still tinged with a hint of disbelief. "I think I figured it out." Sarah, who had been sitting quietly by the window, looked over at him with a mixture of concern and hope. Luke, standing just a few feet away, nodded encouragingly. They both had been waiting for him to find his own way, to make his own choices, but they hadn't pushed him. They knew this had to be Jamal's decision, not theirs. Figured out what? Sarah asked softly, a smile tugging at her lips. She had been through so much with him, but now there was a sense of peace in her eyes, as if she finally saw the son she had raised standing in front of her, ready to take on the world in his own way. Jamal held up the email, showing them the invitation to the program. This is what I've been looking for. It's not about the scholarship or what other people want. It's about doing something for myself, something that feels right. Luke leaned forward, his eyes wide with surprise. That's amazing, man. I'm proud of you. Sarah's face softened with emotion, her eyes glistening. I knew you'd figure it out, Jamal. I always knew. In that moment, Jamal felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for the people who had stood by him. Even when he didn't fully understand what he needed, they had always believed in him, even when he didn't believe in himself. Now, he understood that the love and support of his family and friends were the things that had carried him through, not the accolades or the external markers of success. He wasn't just walking away from the scholarship or the expectations of others. He was stepping into a new chapter where he could finally honor his own desires, his own dreams. He wasn't sure what the future would hold, but for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to embrace it. Days passed as Jamal made plans to join the program, packing up his life and saying goodbye to the familiar pressures he had carried for so long. It wasn't easy. There were still moments when doubt crept in, when he wondered if he was making the right choice. But every time the doubt appeared, he would remind himself of the freedom he felt in choosing his own path. The world had a way of making people feel small, of telling them that their worth was tied to their success or their ability to conform. But Jamal had learned something invaluable. His worth was not defined by others. It was defined by him, by the way he chose to live his life, by the decisions he made for himself. When Jamal finally left the small town where he had spent most of his life, he didn't feel the sadness he had expected. Instead, there was a quiet sense of hope, of possibility. He was leaving behind a life that had been full of expectations and pressures, and stepping into something unknown, something that could be whatever he wanted it to be. His journey wasn't going to be easy. There would be struggles, obstacles, moments of doubt. But Jamal knew now that those moments didn't define him. What defined him was his ability to keep going, to keep fighting for what mattered, and to never stop searching for life that truly made him happy. As he boarded the plane to start the program, Jamal looked out the window at the vast expanse of the world below him. The sky was open, endless. He realized that his life, like the sky, had no limits. He wasn't just another success story, another trophy to be won. He was Jamal, and that was enough. He thought back to all the people who had doubted him, who had mocked him for daring to make a different choice. They had their version of his story, the one they expected him to follow. But Jamal wasn't interested in their version. He was living his own. The twists and turns of his life had brought him to this moment, and for the first time, he felt fully in control. He wasn't running away from anything anymore. He was running toward the life he wanted, a life he was creating, one step at a time. As the plane soared higher, Jamal looked out the window once more, a smile forming on his lips. The future was unknown, but it was his, and that was all he needed to know. The journey had only just begun.